Hi, this is Dr. Larry Richard, and I am here today to talk about the lawyer personality, particularly in the context of those of you who are listening that have responsibilities for procurement in a law department and other people that may be associated with those types of practices. Most of the time, you're either going to be dealing with lawyers or dealing with people who have been hired by lawyers. And one of the things that we've noticed is that lawyers tend to hire in their own image when it comes to personality. I want to give you some background about myself first, and then one assumption that I'm making, and then we'll dive into the material. So I started in life as a trial lawyer at around age 2, and I say that half jokingly, because I come from a family of lawyers going back 3 generations. And in our extended family gatherings, we had about 22 people at a typical family table. 14 of those 22 were lawyers. So that's my background and training. I practiced as a litigator for 10 years before I realized that it was not a good fit for me. And I went back and re-credentialed, trained as a PhD psychologist in organizational psychology. And for the last 20 plus years, I've been working with law firms and law departments on behavior issues. I basically summarize that by saying it boils down to 2 things. How do you get lawyers and those that they hire to do stuff? And how do you get them to not do stuff? So here's the assumption that I'm making for today, that when you're trying to influence behavior, or to make your job easier, the basic thing that is often the stumbling block are the personality traits of lawyers. And that's because there is a dramatic tendency or trend, if you will, for people who go into the legal profession to be atypical compared to the public. That is, there are certain personality traits that self-select. Either the trait that people in the legal profession have is much more pronounced than that trait normally is in the public, or it's much less pronounced than it is in the public. There are 7 such traits, and this is on a system that uses 21 traits. In the general public, when we measure the public, all 21 of these traits, if you measure enough people, will average in the middle. So we're using a percentile scale that goes from 0 to 100%. 100% score on any trait, let's say a trait like cautiousness. If somebody had a 99% cautiousness score, that would mean this person is really cautious. And a 1% would mean they throw caution to the winds, they just shoot from the hip. The average for any trait, if you measure the general public, is 50% for every one of the 21 traits. Every trait averages in the middle. It's a bell curve, and there's a smaller number of people that score really high or really low on any trait, but the vast majority of people score in the middle. And so because that's a trend, and every trait is the same statistically once you get a large enough database, and the test I'm using is called the Caliper Profile. It's been around since 1964, and they have tested at this point over 6 million people. So that's way far than you need to get a bell curve distribution, which means we're comparing every trait that we measure in the legal profession with the public scores. And the public, I said, is 50%. So 7 of the 21 traits are atypical in the sense that they fall below the standard deviation, which is about 10 points either side of the middle 50%. In short, any trait where the average for lawyers is below 40 or above 60 is an outlier, is atypical, is odd. And yet I have consistently over the past 25 years seen these 6 of these traits below 40 and above 60, or above 60. One of them, the 7th trait, is a newcomer. It's only the last 3 years that it's been an outlier, but it's been hovering on the edge for many years. It's just that it's finally started to go down. So what are these mysterious traits? The first one is high skepticism. This should surprise no one. And that is in order to do their job, lawyers have to do three things very well. They have to look for problems and ask the question, what's wrong and what could go wrong, which means they have to be vigilant about anything that they find. They have to always wonder what's wrong with it. Number two, they have to challenge any assertions that people make about stuff. And number three, they even have to go one step further and question the motives or the legitimacy of the individuals. Why are you saying that? Why are you doing that? Why are you asking me for that request? So those are normal, good, positive things that lawyers are trained to do. And because that's the day in and day out work of a lawyer, not surprisingly, the profession attracts people who already have high skepticism scores. And when they spend a lot of time in the legal profession, it increases their skepticism year in and year out. So by the time I measure them, which is usually 10 years in practice or longer, their average skepticism score is higher than 90% compared to the public at 50%, which means this is a really, really skeptical group. That means that if you're going to influence lawyers, and this extends to those that are not lawyers but hang out with them or are trained by them or hired by them, you're going to need to first expect a lot of skepticism for things that you may say to them, even if it's intended to be helpful to them. And secondly, in order to effectively deal with them, you want to have information at your fingertips to provide evidence for any assertion that you make, because I guarantee they're going to press you for the evidence. So high skepticism is very normative, quite common for lawyers. There's nothing that I've discovered in 25 years of looking at this one trait that can bypass the skepticism of a lawyer. You basically have to expect it, anticipate it, and the best strategy I have found is to roll with the punches. In other words, don't try to fight, don't try to arm wrestle people who are skeptical and convince them, because that's not going to work. Simply act more like marshmallows. In other words, they say something skeptical and you just nod and go, yeah, there's probably a chance that that could be bogus. But just in case it's not, let me tell you my proposition. So you're basically accepting their skepticism and not trying to debunk it. What's the second outlier trait? High abstract reasoning. This means lawyers love analyzing. They love looking for intellectual information that they can process. They like solving problems. And they also like challenging themselves and challenging other people. So even if they weren't skeptical, they would challenge you just because it's fun to argue with people. So now you have the combination of skepticism, which makes them challenge the content of what you're saying, and high abstract reasoning, which makes them challenge anybody who makes an assertion just for the fun of it. And you get a really high probability that the person you're interacting with is going to challenge you. So again, I underline the axiom of be prepared. What's the third trait? Third trait is high urgency. Urgency, you can think impatience. It's really the same thing. It's just a fancy word for impatience. This is one of the more hardwired traits. People who are high in urgency can't wait to get to the finish line. They talk fast. You may notice that I tend to be a fast talker, relatively speaking, because I'm high on urgency. We're always wanting to be where we're going, not where we've been. High urgency people may finish other people's sentences. We may be impatient waiting for a result. We may start doing something ourselves that's somebody else's responsibility just because we want to get to the finish line. We may interrupt in meetings. We may be the most outspoken people in meetings because we tend to be impatient. And because it's so hardwired, and because it's the only trait I'm going to mention that occurs whether you're in interaction with people or you're alone in a room. You can be urgent hanging a picture on a wall with nobody else around. All the other traits require some relationship in order to bring them out. But urgency, it can come out when somebody's driving on the highway or hanging a picture or doing anything. So it's a very pervasive, strong trait. And to take it into account, again, be prepared. That's the first thing. One of the things I found is that if you start where a person is, you start by responding in a fast-paced speed of speaking, and then you slowly and almost imperceptibly slow the rate of speaking down, not to a point of absurdity, but if you start really fast and then you slowly back it off and you slowly come to a normal speaking speed, if you're in rapport with the other person, even though they're naturally urgent, they may slow down a little bit. It's a little psychological trick that tends to work pretty well. Trait number 4, high autonomy. Lawyers really, let's start with this proposition. Everybody likes to have some freedom, some control over our own world. We like to feel like we pull the strings in our own life. I'm in charge of me. And I like to do things where I feel like I'm the author of my behavior. I chose to do this. I decided when I showed up this morning. I figured out the sequence in which I'm going to do something. The more that we, this is true of all human beings, we all have this need for autonomy. But the people that go into the legal profession, and here I'm talking not just lawyers, but almost everybody I've measured in a law department, for example, has elevated levels of autonomy compared to the public. We are autonomy junkies. We really, really don't like being told what to do. We don't like hierarchy, even though if you're in a law department, you're part of, by definition, a hierarchical corporate structure. And of course, companies vary in terms of the degree of that, but they're more structured than law firms as a general rule. And those two institutions law departments and law firms have less autonomy than very hierarchical companies of other types. So for example, banks, insurance companies, and so forth. Now, the people that go into the legal profession take this a step further, because the public, even though they have a high need for autonomy, it's all relative when we measure these traits. So the average public is at 50%. And we have an 89% average for lawyers. So we just have autonomy needs that are unbelievably high. And that means we're always seeing people trying to compromise our autonomy, even if it's not really true. I'll give you an example. I was at a CLE conference a number of years ago when I was still practicing law. And it was a boring seminar, and I was sitting in the back of the room and I was twiddling my thumbs, and my pen popped out of my hand and rolled under the seat of the guy sitting next to me. And in a stage whisper, I didn't want to draw the attention of the lecturer, I said to this guy, "Excuse me, my pen's under your seat. Could you hand it to me?" I didn't want to start crawling under the guy's legs, so I asked him if he'd pick it up. And he says to me, "It's your pen, you pick it up." Well, I said, "Yeah, but it's under your seat." And he said, "Yeah, but it's your pen." And here we are having this argument about who is the person that's going to pick up this darn pen. And I realized at that point that we both had high autonomy, and if I didn't pick it up, it wasn't going to get picked up. So autonomy is a really strong need for us. And that means if you want to get people to do things, you don't want to do it by mandating it, do this or else. You want to have, if possible, have it be their idea. And one way to make it be their idea is to say, I'm trying to achieve X, and I'm wondering if A or B would be a better way to do that. And of course, if you offer A and B the right way, A will seem a little bit more attractive, but you don't let on that you realize that. And you say, what do you think I should do? Well, that plays into their need for autonomy, and hopefully they'll pick A if you've set it up right, and now it's their idea instead of your own. Number 5, low sociability. The people that go into the legal profession, and many of those who have other professional roles, have a strong need for, let's put it the opposite way. They have a very low need for connecting, and especially for initiating connections with other people. Low sociability is best understood by thinking about what high sociability is. So a high sociability person is somebody who has a strong need to connect with others and is comfortable introducing themselves, being vulnerable, sharing things that they might not share, that there's an emotional risk to do so, in exchange for having the other person be vulnerable and build connection and trust as well. Low sociability people will have none of it. They don't want to reveal anything. They're private. They'd rather not even think about relationships. They see relationships as touchy-feely. And if they could go the entire workday without having any talk of relationships or connection, they'd be none the worse for wear. They'd be very happy to do that. So if those of you who are high in sociability naturally assume that other people would want to build connection, and you go about trying to get people to do stuff by building a friendship or trying to build a friendship or saying, do it, do this, please, it would mean a lot to me. To a low sociability person, especially a low sociability lawyer who's skeptical, that's not really going to touch a note. It's not going to play well. It's not going to trigger things. A better strategy is to use logic and to be efficient. That touches the abstract reasoning and the urgency notes, and not play on relationship unless you know that you're dealing with an exception to the exception. In other words, there are high sociability lawyers. They're few and far between, but they do exist. And if you happen to know that you're dealing with a relationship-based person and you are one yourself, then fine. That's a great strategy to connect first so that you can then make the ask. But as a general rule, if you want to play the odds here, you're going to be better off assuming that someone is low in sociability. The 6th trait is really important, low resilience. So again, let's look at its opposite to understand it. High resilience, it's a trait that has to do with how you react to criticism or rejection. There are actually 2 kinds of resilience. I call them big R and little r. Big R resilience is what we normally think of when we hear the word resilience. I suffered some sort of catastrophic tragedy. I got caught in a typhoon. My house flooded. I was in a car accident. And how we bounce back from those moments of tragedy that life serves up is big R resilience. And just about everybody can reach down for that extra ounce of energy and bounce back when they encounter that kind of crisis. Little r is more of a day-to-day type of resilience that has to do with what we do when someone criticizes us or excludes or rejects us or treats us bad in other ways. And that is a much more personality-based type of resilience. There are people that are born with high resilience and there are people that are born with low resilience, but our experience also influences where we are in this. So we can actually raise our resilience if we want. Again, this is a distribution in the general public on a bell curve. So 50% is the average on a scale of 0 to 100. There are some high resilience people and some low resilience people, but not in the legal profession. My testing of lawyers shows that for 25 straight years, lawyers average, or I should put it a different way, 90% of the lawyers that I test have a resilience score below the midpoint, below the 50% score. I've seen lawyers with 1% or with other single-digit scores more than I've seen lawyers with middle scores, and I almost never see lawyers above 50%. Every now and then, like I say, 10% of the lawyers score above 50%. 60s, 70%, 80%. Every now and then I'll get somebody who's above 90, but it's maybe once or twice a year. Whereas I can count on it like clockwork, the vast majority of people I test are going to be below 50% on this trait. And many of them are going to be below 30, below 20, and below 10. Low resilience is so pervasive that anytime you ask for something, it could easily be perceived as a criticism, even if you didn't mean that way. So let me give you an example. Let's say we're walking down the street and we pass a lovely clothing shop, and I turn to you and I say, oh, look at that outfit in the window. You'd look smashing in that outfit. If you're a high resilience person, you would say, well, thank you very much. That's a compliment. If you're really low in resilience, it doesn't sound like a compliment. What you say is, what, you don't like what I'm wearing? And that defensive reaction focused on what's wrong instead of hearing that you think I'd look great in that outfit, that's low resilience at work. It distorts the communication, so we feel criticized. And you can never go wrong assuming that the person you're talking to is going to feel hurt, wounded, criticized. Even a request to do something differently, even if it's better, may make them feel like what they're doing, you're criticizing. And so you probably want to do something by way of reassuring them that, you know, I in no way mean this as a criticism. In fact, you're doing a great job. Here's something you can do to be even more effective. That doesn't even always work itself, but at least it overcomes some of the low resilience. The last trait is the one that has been within the standard deviations, between 40 and 60. It's hovered at 41%, which is not an outlier score, even though it's very close to it, for most of the 25 years. But the last 3 years, this trait has been dropping, and it's a trait called cognitive empathy. Cognitive empathy is not emotional empathy where you feel bad for somebody, for example. Cognitive empathy is an intellectual skill of stepping into the shoes, taking the perspective of another person. It's really, really important trait for working with other people. It's a really critical trait for leadership. It's a really critical trait for anticipating what customers would be wanting or clients would be wanting. And millennials are dropping precipitously in this trait across the general public and in the legal profession. And that's pulling the whole profession down. Lawyers in general at any age are low in this to begin with, but the youngest lawyers tend to be lowest in it. And that means they may be making decisions based on what they need, what's in their interest, and they may not be anticipating how is this going to play out for you. The good news is this is a learnable trait. This is something you can learn yourself and get better at just by paying attention to the perspective of the other. And you can actually encourage other people just by asking them to step into your shoes and take some time to think about the effect from your point of view. So these are the background noise, if you will, the background conditions that you encounter when you're dealing with most lawyers or other professionals that they've hired or trained. And these are not fatal, but what is fatal is if you don't recognize that these traits could be stumbling blocks. So the best pathway forward to influence other people is to be prepared in anticipation of their skepticism, to engage them in logic, be prepared for a back and forth because they love analyzing, be prepared to answer their questions quickly without a lot of fluff so that you meet their urgency needs, give them a chance to think it was their decision instead of you declaring martial law. Don't use a connection strategy unless you are very, very confident that they are the outlier to the low sociability pattern. Build up their resilience so that they don't feel unwittingly hurt, even though you didn't intend it as a criticism. And make sure that you take their perspective and encourage them to take yours, since it probably won't happen automatically. I hope that's helpful to everybody. I will ask Sylvia to let me know if anyone watching this has questions. It's perfectly fine with me if she invites people to email me with their questions. And I hope this has been helpful to everyone. Thank you very much for your time and attention.